Hello everybody, hope you're doing okay. It's Chicago Marathon time, and it looks like already Floberg and Ben Felton have found each other, and there's also Ben Johnson out on a little shakeout run. So I thought I'd do a bit of a training analysis video as usual. I'll do Floberg and Ben Felton, and we thought that Yowana was going to be running the Chicago Marathon, but it doesn't seem like he is, but he does seem to be tapering down for some race, so I thought it would be interesting to compare him as well. Okay, so this is my usual spreadsheet broken down into the 14 weeks prior to the race, but taking out this week being the taper week. So really what these stats here is analysing the 13 weeks of training. So basically from the start of July up until basically last Sunday. So you can see here I've got various stats about the three athletes, Ben Felton and Eric Floberg, remarkably similar average run miles per week, 84 and 85, more or less identical. But Floberg considerably slower pace, almost a minute a mile slower, and Yowana ran somewhat more mileage than both of them, but a very similar average training pace to Eric. Having said that though, that their targets and PBs perhaps are slightly different. Ben Felton has the fastest PB by some way already, 2:24.26 from Berlin in 2023. Eric Floberg 2:32.44 from the McCurdy Micro Marathon earlier this year, and Yowana from Chicago last year. Now, I thought, as did a lot of people, that all three would be running Chicago. It turns out that Yowana isn't running Chicago, but he hasn't sort of said where he is running, if anywhere, because he seems to be tapering. It's got to assume for something. So what's interesting here is I looked at their average training marathon paces for the actual PB as against what they appear to be doing this time. So Ben Felton this time appears to be targeting a PB, and Eric as well. Eric has themed his video series No Time, but clearly, as he said in his latest video, he wants to do a PB. He hasn't actually sort of said what his actual target is. So some of these stats here I've had to sort of infer from what they appear to be doing. So Ben Felton, for instance, appears to do most of his marathon pace blocks around about 5:30 minutes per mile, and I put the kilometres on there, 3:25, sort of targeting around about a 2:24. I think based on what he said in his last video, aiming to do a PB somewhere like 2:22, 2:23, I think something like that. So I've gone for 2:23, and I put my forecast down pretty similar to what his target is. And Eric's there, 2:29, I think he's going to be going for, but ultimately I think his sort of main target is to beat that 2:32. As a result, I thought my forecast would be just slightly more conservative than a sub 2:30. And Yowana, I think, has gone on record as saying that he is targeting a 2:30, wherever that happens to be. But he seems to run a slightly slower pace. Having said that, you notice there that he runs a lot more hilly area. His average elevation feet per mile there is 41 per mile, which is a lot more than Ben, almost double. And Eric actually lives in Chicago or very near to it, and it's clearly very flat there because he's hardly doing any hilly work at all. I thought it would also be interesting to roll in the three athletes I did for Berlin, Ryan Thompson, Cole Gibbons and Matt Reese, because they're all basically sub-elite runners, aren't they? So it was interesting to compare what the different sort of approaches here are. So Ben Felton, Ryan Thompson and Cole Gibbons, you would say that they're running pretty much the same sort of average training pace. Ben Felton there did manage to get up to 100 miles in a week, as did Eric, but their average training weeks just slightly less than Ryan and Cole. Cole obviously was targeting initially about a 2:16, but it had some last minute issues, so in the end he plumped for a more of conservative effort and got round in 2:29. Ryan perhaps didn't have the best of runs on the day. I think just the heat got to him, but still ran a very creditable 2:21. I say creditable, it's all relative to what your PBs are on it. So with a 2:15 PB, if you run a 2:21, you can't say that's obviously as good as someone doing a 5-minute PB, even though they're a lot slower. And Matt Reese, my coach, he did a solid effort from me. I think he suffered in the heat a bit. Did say that in hindsight, I think he should have done a few more long runs. So that's another thing we can look at in his training analysis. But he came out with a 2:35, and I thought he was going to do a 2:29. I think he said in his own analysis that he was hoping to be able to run a sub 2:30 if the weather had been better. So he's in for Valencia in December, as is Cole Gibbons, as is Nick Bester, I think, and also ran to Japan Jake Barraclough. So that's going to be an interesting one. So I'll probably do a training analysis for that one. So let's have a look at a bit more detail at Ben's training first of all. Okay, this is an incredibly busy spreadsheet, so I have to point you to various things of interest, but I've got the weeks here. Week 1 was the week commencing Monday the 7th, and we're obviously in now the last week, so the race is obviously on Sunday, and this week commencing the 6th of October is the taper week. I never do the taper week because I don't think there's really anything to gain, and apart from anything else, the week hasn't finished when I'm doing this analysis. So Ben started this block with a bit of a hamstring issue. He'd pulled out out of a 5k just a couple of weeks before. So he spent a lot of the first month, I would say, just trying to get over the actual hamstring issue. Having said that, despite the fact that he had a hamstring issue, he came into the start of this notional 14-week block with still a very hefty 71 miles a week average, but he did progress it nicely, because I think he had some peak weeks here of above 100 miles, which is always the benchmark, isn't it, for a sub-elite runner, you would think. I mean, I think what's noticeable about all the athletes I'm featuring today, that how committed they are as runners. When I think when you look at more everyday runners, more sort of like casual runners, then there's a lot of motivation in there. They never seem to be lacking motivation, these athletes. They're always out every day, often doing double days, not necessarily double thresholds, just getting the miles in. And I think just literally that always strikes me as the difference between an athlete like this and the ones who are sort of maybe targeting a 3-hour run or a 4-hour run. It's just like, are they as talented? Well, it's hard to know, because if you don't put the work in, you can never really be sure. Having said that, these are often very experienced runners, aren't they? So Ben here, 2:24 PB. That was admittedly now 2.5 years ago. So he's had a few runs which haven't been great. 2:35 in London this year when he blew up. I think sometimes he's been guilty of going off a bit too fast. So what's interesting to me here is I always like to look at their longest run, and sometimes that tells me, are they really training for a marathon? Because what was really interesting here, that Ben did a almost out of the blue PB in the Vitality 10k at the end of this block, 30:22, beat Nick Bester by a few seconds, and also Alicia McColgan, who are right on their tails. But that is a considerably better 10k PB than, say, Floberg or Yowana, who probably are be 32 minutes at best, in 33 even 34. So in that sense, massively better athletes at the shorter distances. But are they really training here for the actual marathon? So let's have a look at some of the sessions that they did on the long run. So as I said, Ben was doing a lot of recuperation type work, so a lot of his early runs in the block were around about 6:30 pace, sort of even efforts. I mean, he did put some marathon pace into a run here, this one on the 18th of August. You can see it was quite good, but he was slowing a bit throughout, so that's just probably wasn't quite in peak fitness yet. And also at this time, he was also doing still light things on the bike, and he did an FTP ramp test. I think Zwift had given him a bike, so I think he was keen to see how he did there. And as a novice cyclist, you'd have to say an FTP of 4.28 watts per kilograms, he was obviously quite a light guy, only 63 kilograms, is very respectable for sure. But obviously he's not training to do a cycle race, he's training to run a marathon. And it's interesting here, another athlete has got the Kaizen app, and in that week the app was predicting 2:29.18. At the end of the block it's predicting 2:20. Now I think that was quite optimistic, because whenever I looked at his marathon pace here, it all seemed to be around about 5:30. So for instance here, like this one here towards the end, 2x6k with a 1k sort of float at 5:30 marathon pace. So if you need to run 2:20, well, if you are going to run 2:20, you need to be basically running about 10 seconds a mile quicker, so 5:22 3:20. So I think to me it's unlikely that you're going to be able to suddenly find 10 seconds a mile already when you're a very good athlete to get up to that. So I think this is very good training, very consistent, and he clearly has improved a lot in his fitness. It's kind of quite hard to tell in a way exactly where he's at. I mean, the only real clue is the Stockholm half marathon at the end of August when he did a 1:11. And Kaizen came out of that predicting a 2:24. So that to me suggests that's really that 2:24 will be on the upper end of possible. But he then did another month of good training where he went over the 100 miles here and did a lot of work on the treadmill as well. And I always think sometimes with these athletes, they do a lot of like breaking up marathon training but into blocks, not really too much actually all out marathon pace. The only one I could see here was this one here where he did 16k at marathon pace. Well, 16k is only 10 miles, isn't it? And that's not even halfway. So in that sense, I think that 2:24 is going to be round about where he's at. I think this is very good training, but is this really marathon specific? I'm not quite sure. Time will tell. The good thing is for Ben this time, he's managed to get through this block without having any real problems. I think he got quite fatigued in the middle of the block. Maybe he's just trying to push on these mileages, but that's always going to be a problem, isn't it? When you're training for a marathon at this level, you're always going to be tired. And yeah, the fact that he came out around that Vitality 10k shows that he's got massive fitness there, but is the fitness really specific to the marathon? Anyway, best of luck to Ben. I think I'm going to predict he's going to do a small PB, He could well surprise us, but equally with Ben, if he goes off too quick, which he has done in the past, then yeah, that could be a problem. So let's hope he actually does that sensible and has a good run out. So moving on to Floberg. Now Floberg, I've watched a lot of his videos in the last day or two just to get a feel for where he's at. A very good videographer, really puts a lot of effort into telling a story, and he's a guy that sort of started off as an outside 3-hour marathon runner. Basically over the last 3 or 4 years has progressed his marathon PB almost every race, to the fact now that his PB was earlier this year at 2:32, and I think he ran 2:33 in Chicago last year. So Chicago is where he lives, so clearly he's got the massive motivation to actually run in your home city marathon, a bit like me running in the London Marathon, wouldn't it? And I think the Chicago summer is very hot, but it looks like on race day it's going to be quite a good temperature. I think it's going to be round about getting up to maybe sort of 16, 17, 18 degrees by the end of the race, but they do start the race very early there. I think it's about 7:30 start. So as far as I could see, the best athletes taking 2.5 hours notionally will be all done by 10 o'clock, and it'll still be reasonably sort of not too warm by then. I think some of the runners taking maybe 4 hours, 5 hours will maybe feel the heat more. Maybe they start a bit later and they finish a bit later. It's always a bit of the problem with big city marathons, and people suffered in Berlin like that. Now what I took from Floberg's training this time, he was trying to do a lot more mileages than he's done before, but also perhaps not quite the intensity as a result. So I think his basic aim was to actually get up to a 100-mile week in his mileage, and very consistent mileage there. So you look at the average there and the median's very, very similar. I think he started his own block the week after I've said here, so perhaps ignore that first one at the 70. So the median figure of 90 is perhaps the more crucial, because that is basically indicating what his actual block consisted of. And it struck me that despite the Rat running a lot of miles, a bit like Ben Felton, never really did a hugely long run, but a lot of the runs that he did were with his friends, but not particularly too demanding. It's kind of more of a classical marathon approach of doing your long runs fairly comfortably. It was only really that he did right at the end of the block where he did a Marathon Pacific goal target run, or he actually ran through the streets of Chicago starting very early in the morning to obviously beat both the traffic and the heat. So he started off at 6 miles marathon pace there in this one at 5:35. Now it's interesting, 5:35 to me, that seems to be the marathon pace that he was doing, but that is actually about a 2:27 pace when you actually work it out. And then he went on to do a mile float and then 5x1 mile of threshold in inverted commas, which isn't that much faster than in his marathon pace. So just a bit more effort there. So in total, he really only did 11 miles there of work. So you're not even doing quite half the amount, but it was a 23-mile run, and that was the longest one of the block, so right at the end. But he's got this obviously huge background in endurance, you would hope, for all these consistent mileages. And a bit like Ben, only had the one major tune-up race, a half marathon, 72:13, which was an 11-second PB. It's kind of very similar to me, because I did 72:30 prior to my 2:33.53 in London in 2005, about 6 weeks out. So this is a very similar story. He clearly hadn't tapered down for this one. So in that sense, I think he's going to be somewhere around 2:30, maybe not quite under 2:30. What did I predict? I'll have to go back and have a look actually. Yeah, I predicted a 2:31. So I think in the fact he's got a very consistent mileage, I think it's perhaps a better consistent mileage than I did, and I think he's a better marathon runner. He's very focused on the marathon. Jeff Cunningham is his coach, the same coach that coaches Nick Bear, quite a celebrity coach amongst the marathon runner fraternity, and has a lot of clients, and is often seen on the videos. Sometimes you don't actually see the coaches. It's interesting, Matt and me have never done anything together. Perhaps that's something that we ought to try and do for the year ahead. So yeah, but he did a lot of work on the treadmill or on the track, but yeah, the sessions he did, I wouldn't say they were particularly stellar. A lot of work here, as I said, around about 5:35 marathon pace. So in his actual series, he made quite a big thing of not having a target time, but it was clear that his target was to break his PB, which is 2:32. And I think his major goal with this, to see if he can push the mileage envelope and just see where that takes him. So I think it'd be very interesting to see, because it's more traditional type of training, I'd say, more the sort of training that you did back in the day before the likes of double threshold came in. I can't see any double threshold days here, so clearly hasn't yet bought into that sort of stuff. But I think also you've got to bear in mind it's very hot in the Chicago summer, so that plays into it as well. And he does have 4 kids, and so that's probably why he's doing a lot of work on the treadmill. So I think a lot of very consistent training here. He's a bit of the darling of Let's Run for potentially sort of blowing up in sessions. But I looked at the training; it looked a lot better than some people make out. And I think there's an element here that, well, you've got to be a very good runner to be able to run a 90 miles a week average for a whole training block and run a 72-minute half marathon. That's going to be beyond most runners, isn't it? And yeah, clearly he's not an elite runner. I don't think he really ever sort of makes out that he is. I think he's just a guy in his sort of early 30s who's got a lot of kids, and is mainly into filmmaking, and has seen that he's actually got some talent for running here. So yeah, best of luck to Floberg. Very interesting to see how he gets on as well. I mean, you could imagine that, will Ben beat Floberg? Well, he probably ought to, based on their respective training histories and that 10k time, but it's every chance that Floberg could have a really good run, Ben might be slightly off, and they could be coming up the last few miles together. That could be very interesting for sure. So moving on to Yowana, I didn't do quite the same amount of analysis that I did for the other two, principally because I thought he wasn't going to be running Chicago, but I thought, well, it'd be interesting to sort of compare the approaches, because Yowana is pretty much the ultimate YouTuber in terms of like testing shoes. I think even Seth never did this consistent mileage, and not to the sort of like daily blogging about shoes. His YouTube channel is a very interesting one, but maybe sometimes the criticism is that where do you even start to look at them, because most of the daily videos are about an hour long. He basically takes you out on his run, taking out a different shoe most days. So amazing amount of mileage here. The only YouTuber that you would think that does more mileage than this is Jake Paraclough, ran to Japan, but even him would be struggling some of these weeks. So a peak week there of 142 miles and a median week of 101 with 109 average, and perhaps it would have been higher. I just had a couple of down weeks here, had a down week of 80, and he seems to be tapering, because he's done 75 miles last week, and this week hasn't done much at all. And he seems to be very coy. He sort of said in his comments on Strava and YouTube that he's not doing Chicago, but why else would you taper unless you're going in for some sort of race? And the most sort of interesting run that he's done recently is a race simulation where he did 16 miles from his door, averaging 5:47, but it's quite hilly around where he lives, a lot hillier than the other two. So 5:47 was his average, but the actual gap was 5:42, and that perhaps sometimes the gap doesn't actually tell the full story, because if it's an up and down course, it can be a lot more harder on the legs, and it's obviously not in a situation when you're in a race. But yeah, what does that sort of indicate to me? That sort of indicates to me that he's sort of around about in 2:30 shape, but maybe not quite there. I think in my forecast here I said 2:33. Whether he beat me my PB of 2:33.53 will be interesting, because clearly the approach here was slightly different. He does do some interval session work, but it's very much marathon focused. Doesn't do too much 5k stuff, and he hasn't done any races at all since Chicago last year. So a bit like Sakusa running in that sense. He's just a runner, just seems to like running for the sake of running and doing all the shoe tubing. So I would find that very, very difficult to motivate myself to just train and train and train week after week after week with no sort of actual races. So yeah, you can do solo time trials from your own door, but it's never quite the same, is it? You know, that sort of feeling on the line. And when I did the Mid-Cheshire 5k, I'm sure I ran a lot faster by the fact I had other people around me, and I had John Broom and my friend Phil York as well there to feed off and hopefully stay ahead of. And also I think it's interesting that despite the fact that over 100-mile weeks here, the long runs never actually went above the actual marathon distance. The longest run was a 25 miler, but most of these runs were kind of like fairly within himself. I mean, a slight progression here, averaging 6:27. That's clearly a fast pace, 6:02 for the last 10 miles. But that's basically, is that little more than doing an hour sort of like marathon pace effort with a 10-mile warm-up. And then the 2 weeks before it, you know, outside 8-minute miles. And a run here, 22 miles, starting at 3 miles marathon pace and ending with 3 miles marathon pace. What do you think? That's a bit of an odd session, isn't it? I mean, that's a interesting one. You kind of think, well, you get yourself fatigued earlier on, run steady, and then run hard at the end for a bit. But again, you know, perhaps not the sort of thing you would ever see anyone else doing. So interesting. And another one here when he did a slight progression from starting sort of outside 8 minutes down to sort of 7 minutes with a 1 mile marathon pace at the end. Always good to pick it up at the end of a run, isn't it? But yeah, I don't quite sure how much really Pacific marathon work there is here, and without any tune-up races other than this race simulation, very hard to know. I think sometimes there can be an element that you need to have a competitive experience and knowing that in your head. If you never actually race, I'm also a bit dubious as to whether on the day you hold it together. On the other hand, you can be really up for it mentally because you never actually had too many other races. I think when I did my PB race, I did a race about every month before it, and I made the most of those races, and they were all sort of like near to equivalent of PBs. just unfortunate that perhaps I didn't do any sort of standard distance races. I did like a sort of like a short 5 miler and stuff like that in the time, and never actual 5Ks and 10Ks. I never had par run back in the day either. Well, I hadn't actually got to Bushy by then. So yeah, very interesting to see where Yowana runs, if he's actually going to be racing anywhere. But if he's training for some sort of like time trial or race, then I think it's going to be somewhere around 2:30. But I think, you know, just outside maybe, given the fact he maybe not just quite on the edge of it. And if it's not Chicago, it's maybe not going to be the fastest course out there, is it? So what do you make of all this, and how do you think that these runners will go? There's also, I was wanting to do Philly Bowden, but sadly she had a very serious knee injury. I think she's got a stress fracture in her knee, so she's going to be out for some time. I was also looking to see that we've got Bigger Than Running. Aubrey is going out there with his son. I'd heard that he was going for a PB of around 4:10, but was looking to go out at sub 4 pace, so that would be very interesting. Aubrey just coming out of running the Sydney Marathon, we did a PB of 4:15, so it'd be interesting to see whether he can niff a few more minutes off that in Chicago. It's always very difficult to run back-to-back marathons, isn't it? Very hard to know how you do that. I personally would find that very, very difficult. I always think I'm going to do a marathon, I kind of need to have a few years off to do the next one. Some of these runners are coming out literally doing another one in a few weeks' time, but best of luck to Aubrey. He's certainly been in top form, and he did a PB 10K as well at Loch Ness, didn't he, as well? So clearly in very good shape, and has lost a lot of weight as well. So yeah, looking very lean and mean now, should we say. And also we've got the everyday runner that I can't name. He looks also very lean and mean now, so I think he's got every chance of a PB as well. He's also been knocking out PBs over the 10K and the half marathon. So yeah, I think he's going to be as best a shape as possible. Very hard to know with him how well he's going to go, and obviously I can't sort of say too much, so if you can guess who I'm on about, pretty obvious. I think I also saw that Flora Beverly's going to be running there, another YouTuber. Never quite know how she would go. I think she's more in it for the sort of experience. I mean, having just come out of an ultra, but I think she's been training well. She did do a sub 20 in lockdown, I remember, sub 25K. So yeah, I think she should be under 4 hours, hopefully. And Mack from YouTube was also running. I think he's going with the runner app. I think he's probably looking at about 3:15, 3:20, something like that. So best of luck to him. So who else do you know that's running? And apologies if I missed anyone out. I always think I like to include more people. It takes so long today to do this analysis that I really need to just focus on 1 or 2 people. And I always like to do the sort of sub-elite runners. I think you can learn most from the runners that are better than most, should we say. But I think another time I'll do one that perhaps a bit more ordinary runners, should we say, maybe something in the sub 3 range. Andy, FOD runner, and Robin from Road to Trail want me to do analysis of their blocks for Abingdon and Frankfurt respectively. And we've also got Dawn Broom doing Abingdon as well, so maybe that's a good trio I can do for the next one. Anyway, so best of luck to all the runners, and very interesting to see how everyone gets on. So I hope you're interested in like and subscribe that, and see you next one then. Bye.